What if? What if we listened more to the silence? What might we hear? What if we were to close our eyes and take a deep breath and allow the warmth of the present moment to greet us in the space that is in between words? What if our souls were still enough to perceive that still small voice that whispers softly? What if we attuned ourselves to that hush tucked in harbors of hearts? We listened to the sound of the quiet of the right now. Could we hear our hearts beat? Could we hear the birds sing? Could we hear the leaves rustle in the breeze? Could we hear the air enter our nostrils and pass over the little hairs that line those tender spaces inside our nose? Might we then feel the softness of our bodies and cherish just how sacred they are? What if we were to stop talking? What if we were to stop talking and just listen? Silence has too often come to mean that something's wrong. So we tend to run from it and hide from it. So often we avoid the silence that meets us in the everyday. It's become instinctual, automatic even, to just turn on the music when we drive, to always have the television going in the background when we cook. So often we rush to fill the void. Sometimes even when there's really nothing important to say, we find words. At a meeting, perhaps even if there's too much silence, then the agenda is off. If you're out to dinner and you see a couple eating and not talking, then the assumption is that the relationship is broken. But what if silence was part of the gift of presence, where we could have the best of times in the company of another? And so much could be spoken through the heart alone. God knows I wish we practiced silence better as a society, as a collective, as a community. I think this is some of what James is inviting us to in the 3rd chapter of his letter. And it's subtitled chapter 3, verses 1 through 12 of James's epistle. It's subtitled Taming the Tongue. Now, most certainly in this passage, James is calling us to the practice of the wisdom of mothers passed on from generation to generation. If you don't have anything nice to say, you can say nothing at all. The wisdom of mothers who reminded us that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Right, James writes at the start of the letter in chapter 1, verse 19, he writes, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and even slower to become angry. Right, James is teaching us the importance of curbing toxic speech, the importance of not allowing negativity to pass from our lips. You know, the type of talk that injures and does violence, and at the end of the day, diminishes us all. Now, we know that sadly, such verbal violence has become all too normal in recent years. It was normalized in the White House, and still it's on public display in halls of Congress. But James' admonition meets that gospel song, I will not harm you with words from my mouth. James's epistle is an important reminder. I invite you to read it. I saw some conversation in the chat already. We'll begin Bible study this Wednesday with a new series on James's epistle. I invite you to read it because it is an important reminder, a cautionary tale for us, an invitation. And this morning, I also wonder if there is something in addition to the taming of the tongue that is on the surface, if there's also a deeper lesson lodged within the pages, perhaps a lesson on sacred speech, the gift of silence. Right, when James writes in verse 10 of chapter 3, from the same mouth come blessing and cursing. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. But beloved, this ought not be so, he says. Right, this lesson, it goes beyond just taming the tongue. It's an invitation into a type of discernment, because this is not supposed to be so. There's a capacity, James says, in each of us to say good, uplifting things, and there is also the potential for foul, unhelpful things. He says there is the potential in all of us to do good or to do harm. The propensity to do both exists in us. Right, in this deeper reflection that James points to is something that is actually fundamental about our reality, that there is an ambiguous character and an ambiguous quality to life. And the truth of the matter that he points to is that in some ways, the world is indifferent. That reality is dispassionate and disinterested. Natural disasters, for example, they just strike. Doesn't matter if you're on the Gulf Coast or the West Coast. There's hurricane here and wildfire there. There are earthquakes in Haiti and Mexico. There's flooding in the Southeast, and the list of natural disasters, right? It just goes on and on and on. Diseases like coronavirus, they strike all of humanity. As it is written, the sun shines on the just and the unjust alike. So James is kind of pointing to, reminding us of this ambiguous character, quality of life, the world, existence, where natural disasters strike and the sun shines and rises on the just and the unjust alike. But he doesn't stop there. He goes a bit further. So we press a little bit further. Our task then, in an ambiguous world, in a land with so much indifference, our task becomes to shift the balance and to tip the scales beyond beyond the neutral, this ambiguous in between. Our task, our work, is to tip the scales in favor of the good. Right, catch this, the goodness of God, which dwells within us, calls us beyond complacency into a posture of change. That if life and things happen, if things are ambiguous and different, then our work, our calling, then is to shift the atmosphere, to be the change, to create the shift in the world. To call us beyond complacency into a posture of change. Think about it this way, if our bodies are all in need of healthcare, then our task is to ensure equity of access to quality healthcare for all. Our work, our calling, our invitation is to ensure that life isn't merely a game of chances. where the circumstances of your birth limit your capacity for living. Okay. Our work is to push beyond the luck and the indifference and the in-between into a place where we move from just surviving into thriving. It seems to me that James is revealing something absolutely critical, something absolutely critical about our human condition and how we are called to act and enter into this world, because we don't automatically, naturally do the right thing. Right? If there are two options naturally within us, then it is up to us to choose. Because on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, that. There are these two options from the same mouth, he writes, come blessing and cursing. But it ought not be that way. So if one person has two possibilities, two interpretations, and out of one mouth come two pathways, either blessing or cursing, then it is up to us to choose the pathway that leads to life, the pathway that leads to uplifting and building. And I believe that then silence is the pathway of taming the tongue. Silence is a pathway of discernment that might help us navigate through the in-between into the place that God is calling us, beyond the indifference, beyond the complacency, beyond the either or, where if you roll the dice, it could go left towards blessing, or you roll the dice, it could go the other way towards curse. Then we might have the capacity to discern our way forward through the mess and figure out where we're supposed to go. Silence is the pathway to taming the tongue. It is the pathway to discernment. And discernment is just a fancy way of saying we need to figure stuff out as we seek to make meaning in the world and to live and to thrive in a world that is indifferent about whether we are to survive or not. If the world does not care about us, then we have to care for ourselves and to make the right choices that lead us from here to there, that lead us from just struggling and running the rat race into a posture, into a position where we live the abundant life. And we thrive and we take part in all of the goodness that is promised to us. So we have to figure our stuff out. And I'm inviting, and I hear James inviting us into, when he talks about taming the tongue, that he's inviting us actually to say silence might be the first step in figuring things out. It might allow us to sort our way through all of the distractions in life, that silence carves out space for reflective, thoughtful responses. That we might take a beat and allow silence to be our partner in the work, not to be feared or anxiety producing. Take a beat and reflect and consider. And remember, be still, my soul. Our God is on our side. In a world where the news cycle is just 24/7 and goes on and on. And if you turn on CNN or MSNBC, sometimes it doesn't matter if it's an everyday or a special event, there's talking heads just droning on and on about everything and sometimes about nothing at all. When there's a delay in the schedule, the anchor literally has to fill the time, waste time, but God knows I wish we practice silence a little bit better. Maybe then we could hear God speaking. But I wonder if we sometimes actually drown out God's voice in our lives because we're so busy talking and chattering and bantering, gossiping even in our prayer time, we are constantly talking to God with lists of things, which is fine and good. But the question I have is, do we carve out in our prayer time also an opportunity for us to just be still and silent and listen to what God is speaking to us? But if we listen more to the silence, rather than the voices in our head or the sound of our own voices, and the thoughts that cause us to doubt ourselves, to fear our potential, the voices in our head that sometimes call us to despise the imperfect parts of ourselves that make us uniquely beloved of God. You know, the things that people have said about us over the years that then get lodged in our bodies, in our bones, and we carry with us, and then we start speaking to ourselves. So it seems to me that James's message is pretty simple, straightforward in the queerest kind of way. In order to discern the right thing to say, in order to go in the right direction, in order to figure out the right way forward, sometimes we have to just pause. In order to discern the right thing to say, sometimes we have to just be quiet. And hold the silence a bit. If only for a beat. Because it gives us the space to reflect and be thoughtful, and to discern our way from here to there. At my home church in Buffalo, New York, I had the opportunity to spend Labor Day with my biological family back in Buffalo. And I'm always reminded when I'm home in Buffalo of the home church that raised me, Metropolitan United Methodist Church. And during the early 1990s, we would always begin Sunday service with the worship leader mounting the pulpit and declaring these words from the prophet Habakkuk, which come alongside of the words of James. The words of Habakkuk say, our God is in God's holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence. Our God is in God's holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence. Seems to me that another prophet, Elijah, discovered that when he had to flee, he was running from Ahab and Jezebel, and when he was cleft the side of the mountain, he discovered that God wasn't in the fire, it says in First Kings. God wasn't in the earthquake. God wasn't in the windstorm, but Elijah meets God on that mountain in the sound of sheer silence. Many ancients knew this truth. Anthony the Great, Moses the Black, an Ethiopian, Melania the Elder, some of these ancient mystics and desert mothers and fathers, these desert parents who lived just a couple hundred years after the life of Jesus, they escaped to the desert, to dry places, and there God nourished them. They escaped to the stillness. There, they're provided springs, living water. They escaped to the desert, to the wilderness, to the silence, to just spend time in contemplation with the Holy One. God met them there. Seems to me as we find ourselves, beloved, in this place, between here and there, where so many of us, as this pandemic drones on, find ourselves tired and exhausted. I wonder if we are invited even in this wilderness, in this desert, to lean into the experience where the desert places might become quiet places, where we listen and we experience God anew. And we hear Jesus's invitation to his disciples, come and go with me. A quiet place and rest for a while. Invites them to pray, to silence. And there we start figuring things out and how to chart our way beyond the either or, beyond the place of indifference. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. But the silence, the stillness becomes a pathway for us to figure out our next step. As I conclude, MLK, right? He offers this important question. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? He asks, to chaos or community? At a fork in the road right now, we're at a place that James is talking about. Where do we go from here? To blessing or curse 20 years after the start of the so-called global war on terrorism, where domestic terrorism has always been a thing in our lived experience, when we find ourselves here in the city of Boston, where a city is on the brink of a historic election as a congregation called Union, we too have a choice. Which way to go? Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Blessing or curse? It seems to me that we gather in community to build community so that we might lead the way in breaking through the impasse, so that we might be the change that we seek to be in the world. What if our souls were still enough to perceive what God is speaking to us, and to perceive that still small voice that whispers softly? Could we hear our hearts beat, the birds sing, voice of that still small voice of God leading us from here to there? But God is in God's holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence. Amen.